Before I get into my talk, I feel like I need to give a content and spoiler warning. I will be spoiling the entire game of The Last of Us, and I will be showing a scene from that game that includes some death. So if you're especially sensitive to that, or if you don't want The Last of Us to be spoiled, I recommend you to please leave now. First, I'd like the audience to think of some questions. How many people would you be willing to kill to protect yourself or to protect your family? Would you sacrifice the life of a family member to save the rest of the human race? And what's the difference between giving up, moving on, and letting go? You see, before I played video games, a lot of these questions never came to mind. And I wouldn't even know how to begin to answer these questions. But gaming has pushed me to attempt to at least try to answer some of these questions. And in answering these questions, I've realized that many of the stereotypes about gaming are wrong. So what are some of these stereotypes about gaming? I've identified two main stereotypes that I feel a lot of people have. First is that games are a waste of time, and second, that games are violent. Let's address that second one first. Let's look at some facts. Psychologists agree that gaming causes a significant increase in aggression. And according to the CDC, 3.8 million people suffer from long-term psychological damage due to gaming. Now, I know some of you in the audience think that this is contradictory, but these statistics are not about video games. They're about athletic games, sports. Specifically, looking at that 3.8 million number, that number refers to the number of concussions that occur in the United States per year. And that specifically affects a lot of people who have long-term psychological damage due to those concussions. Let's look at some additional facts about sports. 8.6 million injuries in the United States come from sports. 3.5 million of these injuries are on children under the age of 14. And 775,000 of these injuries on children are so dangerous that they had to go to the emergency room for them. And yet, no one seems to call for a ban of sports. Why is that? Well, we think that we play sports because the benefits of playing sports outweigh the harms. It teaches us important life skills like teamwork and leadership, perseverance, planning, learning from our mistakes, sportsmanship and respect, and responsibility. But I feel like gaming can teach us a lot of these ideas as well. For example, teamwork and leadership is required in order to play League of Legends or Counter-Strike. Sportsmanship and respect, that even after a tough game with friends or in a competitive game, we still have to shake hands and continue being friends. And responsibility, we have to learn to manage our time so that gaming doesn't take over our entire lives. But what about those studies that show a link between video games and aggression? Dartmouth College did a meta-analysis in 2016 of 24 different studies linking video games to aggression. And they found that a lot of these studies had three primary problems. First, that these studies are typically correlational. Now, most of you know that correlation does not imply causation. That people who might be playing for, obviously, if people are playing for 12 hours, they're likely to be a little bit more agitated. And there could be an alternate cause that causes people to become both more violent and excessively play video games. For example, if they feel a lack of motivation in school, they might not go to school, leading to an increase in aggressive behavior, but also an increase in playing video games. Second, we see that defining aggression is especially hard. In one experiment, they asked two people to play a game, and when their opponents lost that game, they were allowed to punish their opponents by blaring an air horn in front of their face. Now, they found that gamers tended to blare the air horn for a longer amount of time. Sure, I suppose that tells us that gamers are better at pressing buttons, but I don't think that says anything about long-term or short-term aggression against other people. Finally, we see that any link between gaming and aggression is very small. I pulled this quote directly from that meta-analysis from Dartmouth College, but essentially what it's saying is that only 1% of the difference between two different people and the amount of aggression that we see between them can be explained by whether they were playing video games or not. Essentially, the correlation is so weak that it's essentially meaningless. And I found some other interesting statistics about video games. There's this idea that somehow games cause school shootings, but both the Secret Service and Department of Education jointly conducted a study where they found only 12% of school shooters actually played video games, while 97% of the general population does, which really pokes some holes into that myth. And next, there's this chart, which shows that while people have been buying more and more video games, the level of violence in the United States has decreased. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that these two are linked, but it does poke a hole into the idea that gaming somehow causes more violence. The second question is whether video games are a waste of time. My entire talk is not just going to be boring you with stats, because when I was younger, a lot of adults used to ask me what value came from gaming. They essentially were trying to tell me that games were pointless, that they didn't teach me anything. But now that I'm older, I realize that games have deeply shaped who I am, and I think many people can relate to that. First, why gaming? Why don't we just read a book, or watch a movie, or watch TV to get our stories? I've done all of these things, but neither of them quite offer the same situation as gaming, because gaming offers something that no other medium has. This is a PS4 controller, but to me, it's a real connection between the player and the characters that no other medium has. And it creates a sense of immersion to the story and empathy to the characters in any story-based game. Let's look at The Last of Us. Now, this game has been either won or nominated for hundreds of awards, not because of its graphics, not because of its gameplay, but because of its immersive story. It really isn't your typical zombie movie because the sense of realism and the emotions in this game are stellar. Emotions start to run a mere 15 minutes into the story as you play as Joel, a young single father who has to carry his daughter to safety after the onset of a zombie outbreak.
Get to the highway! No, you got Sarah! I cannot run him!
Uncle Tommy?
I will meet you there. Hurry!
Daddy, we can't leave him.
He's gonna be fine. We're almost there. It's okay, baby. We're safe. We're safe. Hey, we need help. Stop! Please. It's my daughter. I think her leg is broken.
Stop right there!
Okay. We're not sick.
Got a couple of civilians in the outer perimeter. Please advise.
Daddy, what about Uncle Tommy?
We're gonna get you to safety and go back for him, okay?
Sir, there's a little girl. But... Yes, sir.
Listen, buddy, we've just been through hell. Okay, we just need... Oh, shit. Please don't. Oh, no. Sarah. Move your hands, baby. I know, baby, I know. Listen to me, I know this hurts. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. All right, I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby, I know it hurts. Come on, baby, please. I know, baby, I know. Sarah. Baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Come on. No. 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 Please. Oh, God. Please. Please. Please don't. Please.
See, for many of you, that scene might have been a little bit hard to watch. But for me, this scene was even harder to play. Because even though I knew that the entire game was pre-programmed and coded, I still felt like I was somehow responsible, that I had caused Sarah to die. In books, in movies, and in TV shows, you feel disconnected from the world because you're a mere observer of the characters. You don't have to carry out any actions. But in gaming, you are the character. My goals became his goals. And this sense of empathy, this sense of control of the game, is what makes gaming more powerful than other forms of media. It shows us that we have consequences to our actions when we see these characters carry out different actions. But the story continues. 20 years later, Joel eventually meets another girl named Ellie, who is immune to the disease that causes zombification. And he's tasked with giving her to a group of scientists who think that they can find a cure. Initially, he hates Ellie, and he pushes her away because it reminds him of how he has failed as a father. Slowly, he learns to accept her as his new daughter, and he learns to care for her. And as the player, you learn to care about her too, because initially, while Ellie seems bratty, slowly, she learns to mature. She saves you countless times. And when he finally arrives at the lab, he's confronted with a choice. The scientists say that they want to remove part of her brain to study how she's immune. This would ultimately kill her. So Joel is faced with a choice. Does he let Ellie die so that the rest of humanity can survive? Or does he let humanity continue to suffer through this apocalypse just so that he could save the life of his daughter? And this brings up an idea that seems to be coming up a lot in gaming. This concept of ethical parenting in a post-apocalyptic world. In The Bunker, they ask whether we would poison an entire vault just so that we would have enough food for ourselves to survive. Games like The Walking Dead and Life is Strange present similar ideas. How many people would we be willing to kill to save ourselves? What about our families? What about other people we care about? And all of this brings into this idea of moral dilemmas, that whenever I read or observe something on TV, in a movie, or in a book, I don't have to make a decision. Everything is easy. Because it's one thing to watch a character die, but it's another thing entirely to feel like we caused them to die. See, in real life, we have to be comfortable with making tough decisions all the time, decisions that might not have a right answer. For example, do we pull the life support on a dying family member that has little to no chance of recovery? These moral dilemmas don't have a right or a wrong answer. In school and in life, they rarely ask us questions like this. But I feel like answering these moral dilemmas are important, and gaming gives us the opportunity to at least experience what it's like to feel conflicted. But another skill that I feel like I've learned in gaming is this idea of perseverance. But the first time that I learned this would probably be in the first game I've ever played. In 1996, the Game Boy Pocket came out, and my aunt quickly bought a copy of Tetris. When I was around 6 years old, she came to our house, and she left this there, and she never came back to get it. But I think what Tetris really taught me is the importance of never giving up. Because every time I got to a level, I wanted to keep going. Every time I got a high score, I wanted to get an even higher score. I kept feeling like I could get better, that even if I failed, I could continue and keep pressing on. See, at 6 years old, a lot of adults told me that I should never give up, that no matter how hard things get, I should continue to press forward. But I didn't really understand this concept until I had finally played the game of Tetris. But I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between moving on and giving up. Sometimes we have to skip something that's too hard and come back to it later. This is a death claw. And in the Fallout universe, it can kill you in 1 or 2 swipes. I learned this the hard way when I first faced the death claw. I was killed instantly, but when I respawned, I learned my lesson. I avoided the death claw at all costs, and the second that I saw one, I ran as fast as I could in the other direction. Now, for many of you, this might seem cowardly, but I think it teaches us an important life lesson, that running away from our problems temporarily, only to come back to solve them where we're stronger, is an important skill. After I played Fallout for a while, I had better weapons, I had more healing items, I was better skilled, and I was at a higher level. And then I came back, and I defeated the death claw. But I think what's even more important than learning not to give up or learning to move on is learning to let go. Now, sometimes learning to let go is necessary in uncertain, probabilistic, and chaotic lives. A lot of times, things don't go our way, and some problems can't be solved. Instead, we need to change our attitudes and our approach, our idea of thinking about these problems. This is what psychologists call emotion-focused coping, and I think it's important for all of us to learn. When success is arbitrary or improbable, and when achieving our goals is essentially meaningless and damaging to our own health, we have to let go. With that, I'd like to introduce you to a game called Getting Over It by Bennett Foddy.
Oh my God, this is hard. Oh my God! Oh! No, that's bad. Oh! 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 Well, let's start again.
아, 그게 맥밀런 씨가 만든 거구나. 몰랐어. 이름은 몰랐어. 아니! 시벌레는 진짜! 시벌레 진짜!
But after hours, and sometimes even days, of climbing this mountain, only to fall all the way back to where you started, you hear the voice of Bennett Foddy, who is the creator and the narrator of this game. Sometimes he reads you a poem, but this time he reads you a quote. That to live is to suffer, but to survive is to find some meaning in that suffering. I think this quote is meant to show us the importance of letting go, that oftentimes we're always trying to find the meaning in our suffering. But winning a game shouldn't bring us any intrinsic joy. We only really like winning a game because it was hard to achieve. But what the game taught us along the way, this concept of perseverance, of planning, of teamwork, is far more important than the ending itself. And oftentimes I feel like we put too much thought into the ending of things and not the actual path to get there or what we do afterwards. For many of us high schoolers, we're thinking about applying to college soon, or we've already applied to college. And for many of us, we seem to think of college as this endpoint that determines everything. But I feel like what's more important than college itself is what we've done to get there, is all the things that we've learned about ourselves and about other people. And what we do in college determines our life far more than the actual college that we go to. For the older people in the audience, I feel that marriage works the same way. The person that you marry might not necessarily be as important as how you act during that marriage and how your spouse acts. And finally, reflecting on all of this, I've realized that playing games has allowed me to think critically about our past and about our future. In The Last of Us, the disease that causes zombification is called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. And it's a disease in real life that infects ants. It's based on this fungus, and we can see it infecting this ant here. That what it does is it literally zombifies the ant, taking control of its motor cortex, allowing it to walk around the forest floor, until it eventually climbs on top of a branch and dies, where the fungus takes over the ant, grows this stalk out, and rains spores down on other unsuspecting ant colonies. But learning about The Last of Us and learning about this made me curious about the world, about other times when diseases nearly wiped out the human race. that in 1917, the Spanish flu nearly killed 100 million people. Cordyceps in The Last of Us are partially based on the bubonic plague, which actually killed up to 60% of the European population. And from 1492 to the late 1800s, 90% of Native Americans were wiped out from European plagues. This man is former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, and he listed CRISPR as one of the 6 major threats facing the United States because the potential to create bioweapons that could wipe us out is far too great to ignore. Climate change also presents a new threat to us, that just last year, a Russian anthrax outbreak was caused by anthrax that was frozen in the permafrost. And thawing permafrost is another way that a new plague could be unleashed to humans. Next is I learned a lot from this idea from Fallout. We see that in Fallout, human greed, consumption, and corruption ultimately brings humanity to its knees. That the great powers fight resource wars over uranium, plutonium, and petroleum. US and China ultimately exchange nuclear weapons in a brief confrontation that changes the world forever. But it started to make me think about things that have happened in our past and things that could happen in our future. This man up there is Vasily Arkhipov, and he was a Soviet commander in a nuclear submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis. An American destroyer started firing onto a Soviet submarine, and all the officers on board needed to come to a unanimous decision about what to do. Every single officer on board of that submarine voted to launch nuclear weapons, and he was the only man that voted against it. He told the rest of the commanders that they should resurface, contact Moscow, and then come to a decision. And it's because of him that a nuclear war did not occur in the 60s. And even in our present, just a couple years ago, Hawaii and Japan both issued false nuclear launch alerts over North Korean missiles. But imagine if someone in the military, or God forbid, our president, reacted to these. It would have led to devastation that would be permanent and irreversible. And it's made me realize that resources like petroleum are limited, and given our dependence on oil, what's going to happen when we eventually run out of it? So, what can we learn from gaming? I think gaming has taught me to be more thankful of my friends and to empathize with those who have lost loved ones. It's taught me that our actions have consequences. And it's taught me to care about our fragile world and work to protect it. See, my speech was meant to bring a new perspective to gaming, but I feel like gaming has actually brought me a new perspective on life as well. It's taught me how to solve problems and look at them in a new light, and to be comfortable with facing moral dilemmas. So, pick up a game and press start. You might learn something that you won't be able to learn anywhere else. Thank you.